Hello again. Governments have at their disposal various ways of keeping their citizens submissive and cowed. This is, by the way, something which all governments like to see, not just those of the extreme right or left. A subdued and obedient citizenry is far more agreeable to a government than one which is constantly asking questions and reluctant to do as they're told. It makes the job of governing them so much easier. One way of keeping people in line is, of course, by the use of jackboots, guns, and concentration camps. Hitler and Stalin both found these methods efficacious. These days, though, the world tends to frown on mistreating your own people in too obvious a fashion. Besides, it isn't really necessary in the modern world. There are subtler techniques which work just as well to keep folk in line and ensure that they don't object too loudly to what's going on in society. This entails using the power of the state to pass laws and then enforce them primarily against those whom you see as enemies of good governance. Many years ago, I was in the Soviet Union when Brezhnev was in charge. At that time, there were a number of ways of getting rid of awkward customers, some of which we are now seeing being used here in this country. There was an offence, for example, called hooliganism, which covered just about everything. It particularly covered any attempts at protest, demonstrations, and so on. In those days, if you tried holding up a placard in Red Square, just see how quickly you'd be arrested and charged with hooliganism. The standard sentence was 5 years in a labour camp, completely legal and carried out peacefully against protesters. There was no fuss or bother. They were just arrested, whisked off, and that was the last anyone saw of them for 5 years. It reminds me of events that we saw quite recently, actually, in the summer. This kind of thing is called lawfare, and we've seen quite a bit of it in Britain in recent times. People protesting or even just complaining online and then being whisked off to spend 2 or 3 years in prison. Then there's the way that Tommy Robinson was silenced. The action for defamation supposedly brought by a teenage asylum seeker cost £1.5 million in lawyers' fees to get a judgment against him. Who paid out that money? And do you think it was an individual, or do you think it was funneled somehow for the use of that Syrian asylum seeker by the government? The Home Office then subsidised Hope Not Hate heavily, and it was that organisation which gathered a dossier of evidence and presented it to the Attorney General so that he would bring proceedings against Tommy Robinson for contempt of court and have him imprisoned. It was Hope Not Hate, working hand in glove with the government to use complicated legal procedures to send to prison a man who was getting on their nerves. This then is how totalitarianism works today. There's no need for obvious displays of violence or tyranny. The end result, which is the silencing of those perceived to be enemies of the state or malcontents, is achieved just as easily by devious means which are quite within the law. When Hitler took control of Germany in 1933, he needed to have an enabling act passed to allow him to do various things of that sort, but it's not necessary in this country. All the machinery is already in place to suppress dissent and remove those who are too vociferous in opposition to government policies, and then lock them up. Did none of you really understand this when the lockdowns were imposed a few years ago? Did the message really not strike home when an obscure bit of legislation was invoked to close down every church in the United Kingdom and to criminalise visiting parks or going for walks in the country? Is it really possible that a nation can continue to sleepwalk in this way and just accept every extra curtailment of liberty as being necessary because their government tells them so? Believe me, you ain't seen nothing yet. All the mechanisms are in place for our rulers to institute what amounts to a police state simply by using existing laws. Because they have unlimited money to pursue people through the courts, they are sure to win in the long run against any individual who resists. The hour is late, and in another year or two it will be too late. And that, folks, is what is meant by lawfare.